At the Program on Poverty and Governance, we are a team of researchers, faculty and postdoctoral students, doctoral students, and some undergraduate students. And we work in what we see as action-oriented research that can have an impact in the world on issues that matter to us. We are very much focused on poverty and the problem of violence. Most of our research focuses on Latin America, which is the most violent area of the world. So 50% of the world's deaths by firearms occur in Latin America. And the share of the population of Latin America is much lower than that. So it's by far the most violent region of the world. It also concentrates 41 of the 50 most dangerous cities. And I want to emphasize that the type of violence that we are observing in Latin America is not related to civil war or ethnic violence, but it's related to criminal violence and drug trafficking. Most of this violence is concentrated in cities, and within cities in the poorest neighborhoods of the cities. Poverty causes violence, but violence also perpetuates poverty. So this is like a vicious circle. For example, in the case of the city of Rio de Janeiro, we have been able to geo-reference all the homicides taking place in the city from 2005 till the present, and we know how many homicides take place almost by hour and every day. And with this data, we have also been able to correlate with the existing levels of poverty in the neighborhood, lack of provision of public goods, lack of, for example, electricity or sanitation. And what we find is that there is a very strong correlation between lack of services, poverty, and violence. So this was, I think, in 2010. I led a group of Stanford students from the Masters in Public Policy here at FSI to Brazil. And we interviewed with several government officials, NGOs. We were exploring issues of governance, development, international relations. But one of the aspects that we focused was security. And we spoke with the Ministry of Security, Mariano Beltrame, back then. And I was very impressed by the initiative that he was leading, which is the introduction of the pacifying police units in the favelas of Rio. I was able to go to one of these favelas and speak with the police commander of the UPP unit there, and I was very impressed by the work they were doing. They were trying to create trust among the community. They were creating courses for the kids on karate and martial arts. They were also working, the police was working with the kids on a vegetable garden, and then they were, for the teenagers and older, they were creating different forms of boxing. And so all the goal of the pacifying police unit was really to try to build trust among the community and build a more humane and proximate police. Traditionally, the police had never really gone into these areas, and when it entered the areas, it really entered to confront criminals and kill very many people. So the population was really very distrustful and continues to be very distrustful of the police. I got very interested about this also because I come from Mexico and I've done research in Mexico, and I know how hard it is to get a police that works. The police often is involved with the criminal organizations, and that's part of the reason criminals operate with impunity. So I said, I want to understand what's going on there. And we spent a couple of years doing interviews in the favelas, interviewing with the police, until we developed trust among Beltrame and the police itself, and they started to trust us with confidential information. We started mapping all the homicides in the city. Also, we started mapping how police behaves, whether police were shooting in excess or not, and we are developing a very large study that we're going to be presenting this December that focuses on the use of lethal force by the police and how and ways to limit that force. One of the interventions that we are going to be doing in one of the favelas of the city, Rocinha, which is one of the largest favelas in Brazil, is that we are going to add miniature cameras on the police to observe how the feeling of being observed restrains use of force, and hopefully also increases trust among the community. And doing this type of studies, approximating the police, is a very hard thing to do as researchers because the information is sensitive, is often not easy to be trusted. And as I say, I think that in many areas of the developing world, the police is part of the criminal organizations. So with this information, we are going to be positioned to understand a very important question about policing in the developing world, which is twofold. One is how to create a more humane police, how to restrain the excessive use of force among the police, and how to create maybe technological devices that can help restrain excessive use of force. I think that excessive use of force by the police is it creates serious problems because it creates spirals of violence. The police militarizes, then the criminals arm themselves more, and both end up behaving like criminals. So the police is like the arm of the state arms with weapons, okay? And so if you don't restrain the use of force through rule of law principles and institutions, police behaves like criminals. And constructing this type of democratic humane police is a very challenging, it's very challenging, especially in the developing world. So this is why we think that the project in Rio is going to have a big impact, not only for Rio itself, but maybe influencing what interventions in other areas, like in Mexico or Guatemala or Honduras, which are really also very violent places. One of the aspects that has been important of our work is to humanize the police. And so one of the findings that I think is important is we did a survey to 6,000 members of the police, so it's around 20% of the entire corporation, about experiences of violence they suffered in childhood and adolescence, both to themselves and their families or close friends. And we found that the police has been embedded in a very violent society, and that around 45% of the officers report having witnessed a homicide. Many of them report having been victims of crime themselves or their families, having heard gunshots constantly in their childhood. So we did a statistical analysis with this data, and we were able to demonstrate that those officers who disproportionately suffer violence in childhood tend to engage in more violence. And I think this is a very important finding that humanizes the police, but also highlights a problem maybe of selection, so who selects into the police. And maybe knowing this information, we can devise better ways of identifying who should or not should join the police. No. So that was a very important finding. Another finding is that they are under a lot of stress. They really live in constant confrontation, and that obviously creates a lot of stress. So stress causes more violence, violence causes stress. And I think that in highlighting these results, interventions can be devised to help officers deal with this stress and enable them to escape the spiral of violence. So that's another very important result of our. And finally, we discovered that police use of force, which is not surprising considering what has happened recently in Missouri, in the US, that it concentrates disproportionately in poor neighborhoods, and that hits the poorest the more. And one of the interviews with the police highlighted that officers know when they are dealing with individuals, when they are dealing with very poor individuals, they know that they don't have a knowledge of their rights, and they know that they can treat them with less respect. I think this is important. We have to be aware of these biases against the poor. And I think that's another very important finding of our result. What we observe is that some places the impact has been amazing in reducing dramatically both the violence itself and the use of force by the police. And that is a very important finding. So we know that the intervention has dramatically reduced the use of lethal force by the police, which is a very important result. But we also have seen that in some favelas where criminal organizations are very strong and they are very armed and powerful, the intervention is less successful. And in these places, the UPP still behaves very much like the police used to behave before, very violently, and there is a lot of confrontation. So I think we can understand with this research the conditions under which you can really reduce violence with this approach of proximity, and the conditions where you might need other types of interventions. So there has been success, and another good indication is that Mariano Beltrame, who is the Minister of Security, is now re-elected to his position. There were elections in October, and there was a question whether the UPPs were going to continue. So he was re-elected. The government was re-elected, and he will continue as a Minister of Security. I think it's very important to give continuity to this process, because every time something goes wrong, so every time, for example, the police kills in excess, or every time the police is killed, forces on both sides call for stopping the reform. So there is always a temptation, no, let's go back to the military strategy that we followed before. And many members of the police want to go back to that strategy. And so it's important to give continuity, because this process is a very challenging one, and it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to change the culture of violence among the police itself and the violence in the city. And here I have to mention that the violence comes from drug trafficking and the fact that there are a lot of arms and weapons in the streets. And so in that sense, there is a strong connection with what is happening in the US, what is happening in Mexico, what is happening in all over Latin America. The increase in violence in general in the region is very much related to drug trafficking. And I think people have to understand in this country that the main market for drugs is in the United States. So there is a lot of externalities that is causing for Latin America, Central America.